Hey, how's it going, everyone? Just going to do a video on reincarnation. It's a topic that I've mentioned a few times and on live streams and stuff like that, hinted towards it. Groups like the Hebrews, they bring it out, not very regularly, but they teach this. And I would say I've known this just before, just from when I've read the Bible at a young age. When I first started reading it, I just took it literally. I had no reason to not, and I think that in many ways made it very attractive for me, just as a person searching for truth. And the first verse that I'm going to use to support this, when I read it, I just took it literally, and then it was in my mind that that's just what it is. And coming from a Hindu background, it also made this quote unquote potential truth, much easier to digest for me. But I would say I was not even informed by that, upbringing. I just have a sense that this is the way it is. Obviously the details and the mechanics will not be addressed in this video, but, for those who are open to this, I want to talk about it. So this video is not for people who are not spiritual, don't think that they have a spirit in them, and really don't want that, that's fine for people if they're in that camp. This video definitely won't make sense. This quote, recycling of the souls, will not make sense if a person doesn't think that they have a soul or a spirit or an energy that lives on, and then, or in the very least, want that to be the case, or believe that to be true. So it's better just to, use your time, on something else. But for those who, are in that, niche group, this could be something interesting to look into. I'll provide, many verses, and I'll also tie it to the concept of hell and how I believe that these two teachings are very much interrelated. So reincarnation, the verse that I think that got this planted in my head, because I used to read the Gospels all the time, over and over again, and to some extent still to this day. But in Matthew, and anything Jesus says, I take it literally unless there's like a real reason to not. Like if he says, cut your arm off if you're sinning, he's not saying that literally to do that. So he's like, when he's being sarcastic and exaggerating, it's like, it's obvious. But I also think in those situations, if a person was that tormented by their own sin and they did something like that, it would still fulfill the Bible. He's not going to, get angry because someone took his words literally, and so they were so upset, at their own sinning that it caused them to do something drastic. Again, not recommending anybody cut off their arm, but they would still hold true. He wouldn't say anything that's a lie. That's my point, fundamentally. Even if it's, an exaggeration and stuff like that, it would still be, quote, true. It has to be. We have to believe that because he describes himself as literally the truth. But on this verse in Matthew 11, starting with 13, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if ye will receive it, this is Elias, which was for to come, Elijah. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. So whenever, in my opinion, Jesus says these kind of things, there are truths that people know, that he will say, parable of the story of the Good Samaritan and all that. Like, people will receive that. They don't need there's no encoding in that kind of a story for those who just have common sense, that all he's getting at is in that act, it is the act of kindness that's the paramount. God is not evaluating a person's background or their vocation, their occupation and all that when it comes to charity, and so that's the quote point, and that doesn't require for him to preface that with, if you have an ear to hear or if you will receive it. But a topic like reincarnation, it isn't for very many people, and at the end, I don't say any of this to sound arrogant. This is just people like me, and I'm thankful that there are people out there. We want to know why we're here, fundamentally. We do. It's just, we don't care. We go through the day-to-day, we have to, but there's this lingering question throughout my entire life, I would say, that I was able to sort of think about these things. Why am I here? And where am I going, after I quote unquote die? And so people, in my opinion, that pursue God, pursue truth intensely like I do, there are, in my opinion, certain things that we are now open to, we're allowed to think about, and discuss through this video the potential that it's true. And so it's not for everybody, even those who are quote unquote spiritual. But again, like Jesus says here, I'm just reading it straight from the Bible. And if ye will receive it, this is Elijah. And he's referring to John the Baptist, which was for to come. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. I also think it's interesting, just reading on, but whereunto shall I liken this generation? It is like unto children sitting in the markets and calling unto their fellows and saying, we have piped unto you, and yet ye have not danced. We have mourned unto you, yet you have not lamented. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he hath a devil. So if we come very pure, and I've seen this in my own life, and just it's obvious too in this generation, people who are very, very pure, somebody will find fault with that, or they'll just be ignored. They'll be like, that person's crazy. What's wrong with them? They care too much about their health and other people's health and spirituality. Like, leave that person alone. And then Jesus says in verse 19, the Son of Man himself came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a man gluttonous and a winebibber and a friend of publicans and sinners, but wisdom is justified of her children. And so he's saying that the people who will understand what's going on, they will be the ones that will justify, God's works, that God is being glorified in John the Baptist and certainly in Jesus Christ. And so people who understand what he's saying, we're not confused by this. We understand that God is able to glorify himself in even a prostitute, and just people that we would consider are sinful and ourselves, most importantly, people who are flawed. And so this is not confusing for people who truly understand the Bible, and people who understand that actually in many ways amongst us, God can only be glorified, in our acknowledgement that we are sinners. That is the only opportunity that God is given through us to do anything, is if we're able to admit that. And this is what Jesus is saying, that the people who are not going to do that and say that or have any inclination towards that, they won't understand. They'll find some fault in something. And we see that right now happening in all the debates about the geometry of the earth. But the most important thing is, first, Jesus, when he says something, in my opinion, we have absolutely no reason to not believe that that entity, that person, John the Baptist, is Elijah. He says it, and he also kind of softens the blow, if it's a blow, and if ye will receive it. And so I'll read something in a minute as well as one of the proofs that will explain that it's for certain people that God, quote, opens their mind. And I'll literally read a verse that will support that in order for us to receive flat earth, Jesus is God. He died, a death on the cross. All these truths, for God exists, the God of the Bible exists. These are all things that God needs to open our mind in order to receive. And he does it on his own time and for his own purpose, but there's biblical support that God literally controls that. And this truth, if it is true, the way I'm about to teach it, requires God, to co-work with us. And so Elijah was reincarnated, into John the Baptist's body. And it's not shocking as well, because John the Baptist, when he was in the womb, the spirit was already moving, in Elizabeth. And so it's, he was already filled. The body was already filled with a spirit and a righteous one, because it already in the womb rejoiced when it was in the presence of Jesus when he was in the womb. And so there is a quote communication happening. You know how ballers say that gravity works on two masses that are miles and miles apart. They magically know that one another exists, which gravity is obviously fictitious at this point. Even the baller scholars will tell us that it's a fictitious force. It's not a real force, but there's an actual force, an interaction between these two spirits when they're in the womb. And we see that, with John the Baptist in the womb and Jesus in the womb. So he was already righteous, and Jesus says that John the Baptist is the greatest amongst men. And there's no reason to not believe that, and so there's no greatest of all time. All this GOAT stuff that's going on in retarded sports. We know who the greatest of all time is in human form. It's John the Baptist, who is Elijah. And that's what Jesus said. And so if Jesus co-signs somebody like that, we're dealing with a very special entity. And so this is one strong proof, I would say, of reincarnation. And it could just be isolated to this individual or these couple individuals. Fair enough. That's definitely possible. So to add some sort of breadth to this point, I'm going to read the book of Revelation. 1:7 reads, "Behold, he cometh with clouds." These are UFOs. These are chariots. "And every eye shall see him." That's flat earth evidence, not proof. "And they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. Even so, amen." So if every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, we have, again, no reason to not believe that that's true. You know, that there's no way, in my opinion, to even massage that in any way. And it will leave a person confused if they read that, especially because the book of Revelation is already confusing. But they won't understand this verse and the one that I read in Matthew 11 unless they believe that reincarnation is at least possible. And so in order for those that pierced him back in his day when he was physically here to see him now means that those spirits have been reinfused, reinjected into bodies now. And it's not surprising at all. I literally, just from a qualitative perspective, people hate Jesus, and they've never met him. They don't know anything about him. They just have the book and like a bunch of whacked out Christians. Fair enough. But there's also a deeper sort of intense hatred for whatever reason for Jesus himself, you know, as the quote character in the Bible. And that to me can only be if this has been built up, you know, from a past life, past generation. So Revelation 1:7 to me is also a proof for reincarnation, not just for the righteous, but it's also working on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is Jesus. You know, when I use the term right-hand side, I'm referring to the verse that I'll read actually in this lesson, Matthew 25, where God separates the left and the right-hand side. So the highest spirit on the right-hand side is Jesus Christ. And then below him, by his own words, is John the Baptist, which is Elijah. And who knows what other, you know, roles he's played, you know, throughout human history. But we know that those two are one from the verse that I read in Matthew. And then the left-hand side has Satan and then his minions, you know, and his blind followers who will all take the mark of the beast. And so reincarnation is also working on the left-hand side, according to Revelation 1:7. And another verse, this is more qualitative, but something that helps me sort of understand, again, why we're here and why there's a lot of evil in the world. And it seems very, very coordinated from generation to generation. And Ball Earth is also, to some extent, a light proof or evidence of this, because we'd have to have generations of people who are all lying, you know, about certain things, about real science and the shape of the earth. And so there is literally just like a column of people from like past generations that are just like on the left-hand side and actors, you know, and opposing the truth. And so to me, that God could very well just, you know, be recycling energies amongst them, and then they're just going to kind of toe the line and continue the false Ball Earth narrative. But Numbers 14:18 reads, "The Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation." So he's saying he will deal with sin, no doubt, you know, but he'll also forgive it wherever he wants. But he will deal with it, at least in one way. It's not potentially the only way, fair enough, but in one way is visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. So there is a chance that we sleep in the bed that we make, you know, and this is, again, not for very many people, but for those who are open to this kind of thinking, even if it doesn't help really in day to day, it does sort of help to potentially understand more about the mind of God and the way that he works. But here in Numbers, it's saying that a father's, quote, sin or iniquity will then be, quote, taken out on their offspring unto the third and fourth generation. So there could very well be that their children have to pay for it, which happens indirectly anyway. Just the mistakes that our parents make, we have to pay for them sometimes directly and indirectly. But to visit them later in a third and fourth generation leaves open the possibility that that, quote, father is now reinfused into their children. And so they will, quote, sleep in the bed that they make. And I've had these thoughts a few times about just my own life, you know, growing up in a Hindu family. Like, why would God put me in a family of like people who worship like elephants and lions and as gods? Like, how stupid is that? And not even necessarily saying that to be rude to them, but these kind of verses lead me to believe that there was a time in a past generation where I worshiped, false gods. And then God's like, you will pay for that. You will worship these gods, in this, what I believe is the last generation, because of what you've done, in a past life. And so even though to me it's stupid, but it's a consequence, of decisions that I made in the past. And anybody who's had like deja vu, or like they felt like they've already experienced something that they're going through, or they feel like connected to somebody, an historical figure in the past. People have had those kind of experiences and eerie similarities and stuff like that. It leaves open to the possibility, that our quote unquote spirit has resided in other bodies in past generations. But this is one way it looks like that from Numbers, that God is dealing with sin, and in the very least, we already know this. We know that children pay for it in the first generation, but he's also extending it to like many generations. And so God has his own mechanism for, dealing with our good and bad decisions. And so to me, Numbers 14 is not a reincarnation proof, but it's evidence and consistent with a God that is performing that type of an optimization or a pruning. Mark 5 is another good one. I'll start with 6. But when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him and cried with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with thee, Jesus, the Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not." The spirit already knew who God was, this evil spirit. For he said unto him, "Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit." And he asked him, "What is thy name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Jesus knew this. He's doing this for other people that are there listening. And he besought him much that he would not send them away out of the country. Now there was there nigh unto the mountains a great herd of swine feeding, and all the devils besought him, saying, "Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them." And Jesus approved of that, and he allowed that to happen. The unclean spirits went out and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea, and they were choked in the sea. This, again, to me is also subtle, but the person writing the Bible, these verses, Mark knew that a person dies when they go into the water by choking, and so that's not obvious, but to me, people who claim that the Bible is not scientific or knows things, like it's very detailed, in my opinion, in this interaction. But the point of this is that spirits can go from a body into an animal. And so how God can take a spirit and allow it to attach itself, I like to call it stitch itself, into a human, first of all, is an amazing mystery. And then also it then can go into an animal and just literally ride it like a car. Like the spirit can, quote, ride a human, and get into that and operate it and, cause it to like foam at the mouth, and have seizures and all that kind of stuff if it's a devil. And then, but it can also just freely leave and then go into swine, at the word of Jesus's approval, and then, kill itself, kill the animal. And so this is an incredible thing. This is why if you're a spiritual person, we realize now that the spirit world is actually controlling the things that are going on here, even though we can't, quote, see it. And how God is able to then take an entity, even if it's an unclean or clean spirit, and put it in a body and just make it seem normal, it's just, this is where I should be, and I think that is one of the most incredible accomplishments that is just obvious if God exists, and that God can literally, we're all sitting here, and this is where God tells us that we should be, and it's normal, and we just like, hey, high five everybody, hey, what's up, how are things? And when these unclean spirits entered that pig, the pig didn't complain, like, hey, what are you guys doing here? Like, what am I doing here? No, it knew exactly that's where it was supposed to be. And it was at, quote, home, because that's where Jesus sent it. And so this is an incredible thing. And so just the mechanism of how a spirit can go into, literally, in this case, hijack a person's or a pig's brain and control it, that's just an incredible thing, because it does have, to some extent, some autonomy, but it's limited to that pig. And so it decided to, it wanted to be released. And so it went and killed the pig and choked it, a drowning death. And so there is a certain amount of autonomy that we have with our quote unquote spirit, but it's limited to our body. And many of us are crying out for more freedom, freedom from our body, freedom from, all the different structures on earth that are designed to enslave us and all that kind of stuff. There's many levels to the enslavement now, but fundamentally our body is, in my opinion, a form of a judgment, that I've read in Numbers. It's like the things that we know and all the things that we're able to receive about God is also a judgment. And I'll reaffirm that later in a different passage, that is actually true. And these are all things that God decides. And then so we're in this body. And for those of us who are seeking truth and feel like we found some, it's an incredible gift. And I would say rejoice, because only God is able to allow us to receive these. And this is an exciting thing. So this to me is not reincarnation from human to human, but it shows that spirits can, quote, bounce around. They can move from even a human to an animal and still operate, quote, normally, and do things and control it seamlessly. And this makes the mechanism of human to human from generation to generation very simple for God, not for us, obviously. Another one, this is also, I would say, a very, very strong proof that Jesus himself was reincarnated, because he died a grisly death on the cross, and then he appeared to his disciples in the Gospels, and I'll read this one out of Luke, in a slightly different body, and so he obviously wasn't back in the one that was absolutely brutalized, and like all the scratches and all the stuff that they did to him, he didn't still have that, healing. It was a different body fundamentally, and which is why that his disciples, I'll read here, didn't quite recognize him. So Jesus himself proves reincarnation, that the spirit can leave one body and go to another. In this one, slightly more glorified. So in Luke 24:36, while they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." And in verse 37, they were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. They couldn't recognize him. They would have recognized him if it was the Jesus of the past. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do you doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." He came into an actual body, but he was different enough, and I would say in a slightly more glorified state, that it was difficult for people to recognize him. And I think that I've heard this from multiple people when they have situations where they're encountering the spirit world of people and entities that they're familiar with. It's not, they know who they're interacting with, but there's something slightly different. And this is the exact situation here with the disciples and Jesus. They could sense from his spirit after a few moments that this was Jesus that they were dealing with and talking to, but he didn't quite look familiar to them. And Jesus actually explains why. In verse 40, when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. He's reaffirming to them that he's human. They're not having a vision or anything kind of strange hallucination. He's sitting there eating with them. Verse 44, he said to them, "This is why I told you while I was still with you, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the laws of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Verse 45, this is the key point. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. This to me is an incredibly powerful verse that is, again, straight from Jesus's mouth. We can only understand the Bible or care about the Bible if God opens our mind. We don't know why God chose us to preach, his gospel to the poor in spirit, the poor financially, the poor. We don't know, but he has done this, and this is what it says, literally in verse 45. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem." The Israelites were meant to be God's closest to him, that he would reveal things, but ultimately, and it's happening in this day, that the gospel is being preached to all nations, and so this invitation, that I extend, I would say, through my channel and through live streams and all that, is for all people, and we're all of us, I would say, who represent our own gods, and I represent the God that I present on my channel, is extending an invitation to everybody, you know, for him to be worshiped because he deserves it. Verse 48, you are witnesses of these things, you know, and it's the same in this generation. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. And so Jesus is referring to clothing as a form of protection. It's power, you know, and it's tangible. Power is tangible, even if we can't, quote unquote, see it. And it comes from the Most High. And so nothing can be fueled on this earth, physically, literally, or spiritually, unless God authorizes it. And so I know that's difficult for some Christians to understand, because we've been taught that the mechanisms of this earth are operating independent of God. But that's the furthest thing from the truth, and flat earth proves that. God is behind everything. He says that he has the hairs on all of our heads numbered. That's impossible unless God controls everything, like the direction that a person sneezes, everything, how intensely we scratch our head is being noted, because that could remove a hair from our head. You know, I'm saying this a little bit tongue in cheek, but the pressure that we put on our head to scratch our head, God knows that. He could tell us exactly what that number is, because he would need to know that in order for 5 seconds later to update his count on how many hairs are on our head. And God is involved in everything. He has to be. He's either involved in everything, in my opinion, or nothing. He just made this and just like went away. But we have no reason to believe that to be the case, even if it seems like that in the days that we live in. So Jesus here was reincarnated, you know, into a different body. Then I want to end off with how this can be tied to hell. And so to me, the strongest verse that can be used to support that hell is some place that's like not here on earth is, and a very important passage is Matthew 25, the final judgment. And here God is separating his left and the right hand side. And the interesting thing about the litmus test that he's using is charity. Not how many days did you preach, how many videos did you post, how many years have you been in the quote unquote truth, and all this kind of stuff, this madness, this nonsense that, you know, evil people like GMS and people that follow GMS, like end times teachers and others, these people are lost. You know, they have no idea what the true metrics are that God cares about. And it's written explicitly here in Matthew 25, one of the most powerful chapters in the whole Bible, that how God is distinguishing his people from his not people, and he's using works of charity. You know, you visited me when I was in prison, you clothed me when I was naked, you gave me a drink when I was thirsty. That's charity. This is the litmus test. It's not all the Israelites on one side and all the heathen nations on the other side. In this generation, we're being reunited in the truth of the Bible and faith and charity, you know, and that's offensive to people, and that proves that they're lost. That they would be offended by the statement when it's incredibly obvious. But I want to talk about Matthew 25:46, and these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And so all these, if we think of like reincarnation as judgments, and to me, it will have an end, you know. And so what happens to those spirits that are on the quote left-hand side that are being, you know, recycled, like I read, and those who pierced him shall see him, because those same spirits who hated Jesus in his time are still here, and they still hate him, and he will ultimately destroy them, tag them with the mark of the beast, and then destroy them. They have to go somewhere, you know. And so if a person stands, then I would say this would be the strongest evidence that, quote, hell is something over there. But the thing that I find interesting is Jesus didn't use the term hell here, which he could have. And it surprised me that he didn't. But I would say it sort of supports my point in my prior video, is that he's talking about here, and I'll just blue letter the term.
Strong's G, 2851, Colossus.
Colossus is punishment, eternal punishment. And so he doesn't use Hades, Gehenna, Sheol, or just the word hell. He's talking about eternal punishment. And so also one thing again, I'm not lobbying necessarily for my stance that this reincarnation mechanism is happening and our judgments are taking place here on earth purely, but this is the motivation. This is all I can give people on my channel, is the way I think, and I'm being informed by the Bible, clearly. But in verse 25-30, it says, "And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So there is a place that's, quote, outer darkness, which I have no reason to believe is not the same place that he's talking about later in 46, because it's all in the same chapter. And it's the same, quote unquote, left-hand side. That, like, there'll be teeth gnashing. So teeth are not, like, you don't have teeth in the physical world. So there'll be weeping, which cannot be, you know, anything in the quote unquote spirit world. It's a physical place, you know, weeping and gnashing of teeth is a physical place. And in my opinion, that's the lake of fire. You know, that's described in the book of Revelation. Those entities that are here, again, through reincarnation, like I read earlier in Revelation, those who pierced him will see him. It's seeing is physically here. And so they will be here, and then God will deal with them through the lake of fire, which is a literal nuclear war, nuclear holocaust, really. And, you know, this is the conditioning, you know, that's happening. That's in many places explicitly written in the Bible, that God prunes those that he cares about, you know, and conditions them through tribulation. So that's obvious in a person's life, you know, individually. But how it's working in the spirit, I don't know, you know. And I posted a video on the spirit and how it has some sort of signal space analogy, and it's just an analogy. It's, no one knows, you know, how God conditions, first of all, what a spirit is, and then how God conditions it, even in one lifetime or many lifetimes. That's way too much for us to understand. But I guess the point of this video, just to wrap this up, is the Bible, in the very least, alludes to that happening. And so, you know, to me, it just gives us more and more comfort that there is something that's being built up, you know, within us, and then just with what's going on in the world, that there is a very, very brilliant reason for this. And God wouldn't do this just willy-nilly. You know, he has judgments that are being made manifest, you know, and here, this Matthew 25 is the, quote, final judgment. And in my opinion, we're living in the final judgment. If, again, people think the way I do or could hear what I'm saying, this is the last one that we're living in. And so all these things that are happening here in Matthew 25 are the people that are on earth right now who are doing the things that are written here in Matthew 25, being charitable. For I was hungry, you gave me meat. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. We are all doing these things as a way to identify ourselves as God's children, you know. And so the people that don't do that, all the people that just worship, you know, selfishness, greed, you know, all these kind of things, those are people on God's left-hand side. And so, and God will deal with them like he's going to here, but it's already been ordained. You know, it's not like we're doing this to, quote, get anything. We have been appointed to do these kind of things and do these works that are written here. And there will be other people, like some of the Hebrews, that will say that their charity is something else that's written here. And so we know to avoid them by their fruit, literally by their works. And so we can't cut corners with God. You know, we can cut corners here on earth, but not with God, not in his economy. And in my opinion, his economy involves reincarnation. Hope everyone's doing well. Bye.